In 1904, the city of St. Louis, Missouri built a village, not for its own citizens. For 1,100 people shipped across the Pacific Ocean from the Philippine Islands and arranged, by design, behind fences, on 47 acres of landscaped ground inside the largest World's Fair ever constructed. They were not guests. They were not performers. Not exactly. They were exhibits, living, breathing, eating, and in some cases dying exhibits. The United States government organized their transport, funded their housing, and charged the American public admission to watch them live. Official photographs were taken, official measurements of their skulls were recorded, official souvenir postcards were printed and sold by the tens of thousands. And when the fair closed 7 months later, most of those 1,100 people were put back on ships and returned to islands the United States had purchased from Spain 6 years earlier for $20 million. The receipts for that purchase still exist. The postcards still exist. The anthropological reports still exist. But the part of this story that should disturb you most is not what happened. It is how thoroughly what happened was repackaged within a single generation as something it was not. And the files that prove the difference between what was said and what was done are still sitting in an archive in Missouri, exposed to anyone willing to read them. The Louisiana Purchase Exposition opened on April 30, 1904. It sprawled across 1,272 acres of what is now Forest Park and the surrounding campus of Washington University. Over 19 million visitors passed through its gates in 7 months. There were exhibition palaces dedicated to electricity, to machinery, to liberal arts, to agriculture. But the most visited attraction, more than the cascading fountains, more than the Palace of Fine Arts, more than the demonstrations of the wireless telegraph, was the Philippine Reservation. 47 acres. Over 100 structures, and 1,100 indigenous Filipinos arranged into distinct tribal groupings: Visayans, Moros, Negritos, Bagabos, and, most notoriously, the Igorot people of the Cordillera Highlands. The official purpose, as stated by the US government's Philippine Exposition Board, was education. The American public needed to understand, it was argued, the nature of the people their government now administered. The word used in the board's own correspondence was tutelage. The Philippine Islands had been formally ceded to the United States by Spain under the Treaty of Paris in 1898. A brutal war of conquest followed the Philippine-American War, which lasted officially until 1902, and in reality, years longer. Conservative estimates place Filipino civilian deaths in that conflict at 200,000. Some historians put the figure above 1 million. By 1904, the war was being reframed, and the St. Louis Fair was, among other things, the stage on which that reframing was performed. The Igorot village was positioned at the far end of the reservation, past the Visayan and Moro sections, which displayed Filipinos in Western clothing attending American-style schoolrooms. The arrangement was not accidental. It was a gradient. Visitors walked from the most civilized Filipino groups to the least, a physical enactment of the ideology of benevolent assimilation, the official policy term used by President William McKinley. By the time a visitor reached the Igorot village, they had already internalized the premise that American governance was a civilizing force moving these people forward along a fixed evolutionary track. The Igorot, wearing traditional clothing and performing traditional practices, including the ritual slaughter of dogs for food, were positioned as the starting point. The uniformed Filipino schoolchildren near the entrance were the destination. The message was architectural. It was built into the land itself. What the fair's organisers did not anticipate was how completely the Igorot village would dominate public attention, and how difficult that attention would be to control. Newspapers across the country ran headlines about the dog eating. Souvenir postcards depicting nearly unclothed Igorot men and women sold in enormous quantities. The anthropological framing dissolved almost immediately into spectacle. The educational pretense became, in practice, a human zoo. Attendance at the Igorot section alone generated more foot traffic than most entire pavilions. And the fairs records the daily reports filed by Reservation Superintendent Herbert S. Edwards, the correspondence between the Philippine Exposition Board and the War Department, the medical logs, the disciplinary notes, tell a story that the souvenir postcards did not. Those records survive. They are held primarily in the National Archives in Washington, D.C., and in the Missouri Historical Society's archives in St. Louis, and they contain details that the official narrative of the fair was never designed to accommodate. Consider the medical logs. During the 7 months of the exposition, at least 5 Filipinos died on the fairgrounds or in the immediate aftermath of their stay. The causes listed include pneumonia, dysentery, and tuberculosis diseases, consistent with the transport of tropical climate populations into a Missouri summer and autumn with wholly inadequate medical provisions. The logs note these deaths with bureaucratic efficiency. Dates, names, causes, disposition of remains. In several cases, the bodies were not returned to the Philippines. They were retained by the Smithsonian Institution and other research bodies for anthropological study. Skeletal remains of Filipinos who were brought to St. Louis in 1904 were still being identified in American museum collections as late as the early 2000s. The repatriation of those remains is, in some cases, still ongoing. Now set that fact beside the promotional literature. The official guidebook to the Philippine Reservation described the exhibit as a demonstration of American goodwill and progressive governance. It used the phrase living illustrations of the progress of civilization. Living illustrations. The language is precise, and its precision is the point. These were not people invited to represent their cultures. They were illustrations, visual aids in a political argument about why American colonial rule in the Philippines was justified, necessary, and benevolent. The correspondence files deepen the fracture between narrative and reality. Letters between exposition officials and the Bureau of Insular Affairs, the War Department division that administered the Philippines, reveal extended negotiations over which groups to include and how to present them. There was explicit concern that displaying the Igorot in traditional dress would undermine the civilized image the US government wished to project. The decision to include them anyway was driven by a competing calculation: attendance. The Igorot were, as one internal memo described them, the greatest single draw. The tension between propaganda and profit was resolved, as it usually is, in favour of profit. But the paper trail documenting that tension, the memos, the objections, the overrulings, still exists in the archive, and this is where the first pattern connects to something larger. Because St. Louis was not the only time, it was not even the first time. The practice of displaying colonised peoples at world's fairs and international expositions was systematic across Western imperial powers in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. The 1889 Paris Exposition featured a reconstructed Vietnamese village with inhabitants. The 1893 World's Columbian Exposition in Chicago displayed indigenous peoples from multiple continents alongside Filipino groups under Spanish colonial authority. The 1897 Brussels International Exposition included a Congolese village, 267 Congolese men, women and children displayed behind barriers in a constructed African setting, while Belgian visitors watched them eat, work and care for their children. 7 of those Congolese people died during the exposition. Their names were not widely recorded. Berlin, 1896. Antwerp, 1894. London, 1886. Omaha, 1898. The pattern spans decades, continents, and empires. In every case, the stated purpose was education. In every case, the actual function was the legitimization of imperial authority through the visual demonstration of racial hierarchy. And in every case, the logistical machinery required to transport, house, feed, manage and display living human beings was funded and administered not by private showmen alone, but by government agencies, military departments, and scientific institutions acting in official capacity. The St. Louis Exposition was the largest and most extensively documented instance of this practice on American soil. And it occurred not in a distant colonial outpost, but in the geographic centre of the continental United States, 6 years after the formal acquisition of the Philippines, 2 years after the official end of a war that killed hundreds of thousands, and within sight of a university that still stands. The second pattern is what happened after. Within 2 decades of the fair's closing, the Philippine Reservation had been almost entirely erased from mainstream American memory. The grounds were cleared, the structures were demolished. The acreage was absorbed back into Forest Park and Washington University's campus. No permanent marker was erected. No museum exhibit was dedicated to the 1,100 people who had been displayed there. The event was not suppressed in the traditional sense. It was not classified, not redacted, not formally denied. It was simply allowed to fade. It was absorbed into the larger story of the fair as spectacle, as novelty, as an artifact of an earlier, less enlightened era. The word used most frequently in mid-20th century retrospectives of the 1904 fair was quaint. Quaint, 1,100 people, 5 known deaths. Skull measurements. Retained remains. Quaint. The erasure was not total, and that is what makes it more troubling than a cover-up would be. A cover-up implies fear of exposure. What happened to the memory of the Philippine Reservation was something more structural. It was the natural consequence of a society deciding, collectively and without formal coordination, that a particular chapter of its history was embarrassing rather than criminal, unfortunate rather than revealing, and above all past. The event was placed in the category of things that happened back then. And back then is the most effective filing cabinet in the history of public memory, because it requires no lock. No one needs to suppress what everyone has agreed to consider irrelevant. But the files did not agree. The files sat in their boxes in the Missouri Historical Society and in the National Archives, and they did not age the way memory did. They remained specific. They retained names, dates, weights, measurements, dietary records, medical reports, pay stubs for the Filipino labourers who were compensated, and invoices for those who were not. They contained photographs, not the postcards, but the administrative photographs, the ones taken for the files, not for the public. Photographs of Filipino men standing in lines for medical inspection. Photographs of constructed dwellings with notations about square footage and material costs. Photographs of children. And here is where the 2 patterns lock together. The first pattern is the practice itself, the international, government-funded, scientifically rationalized display of colonized human beings as evidence of racial hierarchy. The second pattern is the erasure, not the violent erasure of documents, but the soft erasure of relevance, the cultural agreement that what happened was a product of its time and does not require present accounting. The convergence of those 2 patterns produces a third phenomenon, and it is the one that should command the most attention. When the practice was active, it was defended by the most prestigious institutions in American public life. The Smithsonian endorsed it. The War Department funded it. The nation's leading anthropologists, W.J. McGee chief among them, designed it. McGee, who served as the head of the Fair's Department of Anthropology, explicitly stated that the purpose of the Philippine exhibit was to demonstrate the course of human progress from savagery to civilization. His language was not hidden. It was published. It was celebrated. It appeared in academic journals and popular newspapers alike. When the practice ended not by legal prohibition, but by shifting cultural winds, none of those institutions issued a formal reckoning. The Smithsonian did not publicly acknowledge retaining Filipino remains from the 1904 exposition until pressured to do so nearly a century later. The anthropological establishment did not formally repudiate the racial hierarchies that Magee and his contemporaries had encoded into the physical layout of the fairgrounds. The transition from "this is science" to "this" was unfortunate, happened without a bridge. There was no moment of institutional accountability. There was only the slow replacement of one generation's certainty with the next generation's embarrassment, and the quiet agreement not to look at the files that would show exactly how certain that certainty had been. The physical evidence has not cooperated with that agreement. The site of the Philippine Reservation is still identifiable. The 47 acres it occupied overlap with the western edge of Forest Park and portions of the Washington University campus. A visitor can walk the ground today. There is no historical marker explaining what stood there in 1904. There is no interpretive signage. The landscape has been thoroughly re-landscaped twice, and the topography altered by subsequent construction. But aerial maps from 1904, which survive in the Missouri Historical Society's collection, can be overlaid on modern satellite imagery. The correspondence matches. The contours match. The place is still there. The memory is not. The photographs survive in multiple archives. The Library of Congress holds a significant collection. The National Anthropological Archives at the Smithsonian hold another. The Field Museum in Chicago holds related materials from the 1893 exposition that served as the template for the St. Louis display. These are not hidden collections. They are catalogued. They are, in many cases, digitized. They are available to any researcher with a library card and a question. The anthropometric data, the skull measurements, the body measurements, the physical descriptions recorded by Magee's team survive in the published proceedings of the Exposition's Department of Anthropology. They were printed in official government documents. They were distributed to libraries. Some of those libraries still hold those volumes on their shelves today, untouched for decades, the spines uncracked, the data inside as precise and as disturbing as the day it was recorded. And then there are the personal accounts. Several of the Filipinos who were brought to St. Louis later described their experiences, or their descendants did. Oral histories collected in the Philippines in the mid to late 20th century include accounts of the journey, the conditions, the performances demanded of them, and the return. Some of those accounts describe the experience as coercive. Some describe it as an adventure that became something else. Almost all of them describe a fundamental confusion about what exactly they were being asked to do and why Americans were paying money to watch them do it. Those oral histories exist in Philippine University archives and in the collections of Filipino-American historical societies. They have been cited in academic work. They have not been widely incorporated into the American public narrative of the 1904 fair. The 1904 World's Fair is remembered, when it is remembered at all, for the ice cream cone, the hot dog, and the song Meet Me in St. Louis. These are the artifacts that survived the cultural editing process. They are real. They are documented, and they are the precise equivalent of remembering a house fire for the colour of the curtains. 1,100 people stood on those 47 acres. They were measured, photographed, displayed, and, when it was over, shipped home or buried. The documents that recorded every stage of that process were filed, archived, and preserved with the bureaucratic diligence of a government that believed it was doing something worth recording. A century later, the buildings are gone, the fences are gone, the villages are gone. The ice cream cone endures, the files endure, and the distance between what those files contain and what the American public was ever asked to reckon with remains exactly as wide as it was the day the fair closed. The gates were locked, and the demolition crews moved in. The ground in Forest Park is level now, smooth, green, unremarkable, but the records beneath it, the ones made of paper, not soil, have not been levelled. They have not been smoothed, and they are still waiting for the question that no plaque, no marker, and no official history has yet been built to answer. 1,100 names. Still in the files. Still unread by most of the people who walk that ground every day.